Hi guys! Recently I was given this book as a gift. This is the Grimm fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. They've written stories you might have heard of. I don't know, like Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, Hansel and Gretel. Maybe you guys don't know them. But I was reading this book and I came across a story called Briar Rose, and that story is actually the original name for Sleeping Beauty. And I was thinking, I've never actually read Sleeping Beauty. I've only ever seen the Disney movie. I wonder what the original story actually says. So I decided to read it, and I thought it was pretty interesting. So I wanted you guys to read it with me. So today we're going to be reading Briar Rose from the Grimm's Fairy Tales. In olden times, there lived a king and queen who lamented day by day that they had no children, and yet never a one was born. One day, as the queen was bathing and thinking of her wishes, a frog skipped out of the water and said to her, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year passes, you shall have a daughter." As the frog had said, so it happened, and a little girl was born who was so beautiful that the king almost lost his senses. But he ordered a great feast to be held, and invited to it not only his relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but also all the wise women who are kind and affectionate to children. There happened to be 13 in his dominions, but since he had only 12 golden plates out of which they could eat, one had to stop at home. The feast was celebrated with all the magnificence possible, and as soon as it was over, the wise women presented the infant with their gifts. One was virtue, another was beauty, a third gave riches, and so on, so that the child had everything that is to be desired in the world. Just as the 11th had given their presents, the 13th old lady stepped in suddenly. She was in a tremendous passion because she had not been invited, and without greeting or looking at anyone, she exclaimed loudly, "The princess shall prick herself with a spindle on her 15th birthday and die." And without a word further, she turned her back and left the hall. All were terrified, but the 12th fairy, who had not yet given her wish, then stepped up. But because she could not take away the evil wish, but only soften it, she said, "She shall not die, but shall fall into a sleep of 100 years' duration." The king, who naturally wished to protect his child from this misfortune, issued a decree commanding that every spindle in the kingdom should be burnt. Meanwhile, all the gifts of the wise women were fulfilled, and the maiden became so beautiful, so gentle, so virtuous, and so clever that everyone who saw her fell in love with her. It happened on the day when she was just 15 years old that the queen and the king were not at home, and so she was left alone in the castle. The maiden looked about in every place, going through all the rooms and chambers just as she pleased, until she came at last to an old tower. Up the narrow winding staircase she tripped until she arrived at a door, in the lock of which was a rusty key. This she turned, and the door sprang open, and there in the little room sat an old woman with a spindle, spinning flax. "Good day, my good old lady," said the princess. "What are you doing here?" "I am spinning," said the old woman, nodding her head. "What thing is this which twists round so merrily?" inquired the maiden, and she took the spindle to try her hand at spinning. Scarcely had she done so when the prophecy was fulfilled, for she pricked her finger, and at the very same moment she fell back upon a bed which stood near in a deep sleep. This sleep extended over the whole palace. The king and queen, who had just come in, fell asleep in the hall, and all their courtiers with them, the horses in the stable, the doves upon the eaves, the flies upon the wall, and even the fire upon the hearth, all ceased to stir. The meat which was cooking ceased to fizzle, and the cook, at the instant of pulling the hair of the kitchen boy, lost his hold and began to snore, too. The wind also fell entirely, and not a leaf rustled upon the trees around the castle. Now, around the palace, a thick hedge of briars began growing, which every year grew higher and higher, till the castle was quite hid from view, so that one could not even see the flag upon the tower. Then there was a legend through the land of the beautiful maiden Briar Rose, for so was the sleeping princess named. And from time to time princes came endeavoring to penetrate through the hedge into the castle. But it was not possible, for the thorns held them, if so by the hands, and the youths were unable to unleash themselves, and so perished miserably. After the lapse of many years, there came another king's son into the country, and heard an old man tell the legend of the hedge of briars, how that behind it stood a castle where slept a wondrously beauteous princess called Briar Rose, who had slumbered nearly 100 years, and with her the king and queen and all their court. The old man further related what he had heard from his grandfather, that many princes had come and tried to penetrate the hedge, and had died a miserable death. But the youth was not to be daunted, and however much the old man tried to dissuade him, he would not listen, but cried out, "I fear not, I will see this hedge of briars." Just at that time came the last day of the 100 years, when Briar Rose was to wake again. As the young prince approached the hedge, the thorns faded the fine large flowers, which of their own accord made a way for him to pass through, and again closed up behind him. In the courtyard he saw the horses and dogs lying fast asleep, and on the eaves were their doves with their heads beneath their wings. As soon as he went into the house, there were flies asleep upon the wall. The cook still stood with his hand upon the hair of the kitchen boy, the maid at the board with the unplucked fowl in her hand. He went on, and in the hall he found the courtiers lying asleep, and above, by the throne, were the king and queen. He went on further, and all was so quiet that he could hear himself breathe, and at last he came to the tower and opened the door of the little room where slept Briar Rose. There she lay, looking so beautiful that he could not turn his eyes away, and he bent over and he kissed her. Just as he did so, she opened her eyes, awoke, and greeted him with smiles. Then they went down together, and immediately the king and queen awoke, and the whole court, and all stared at each other wondrously. Now the horses in the stable got up and shook themselves. The dogs wagged their tails. The doves upon the eaves drew their heads from underneath their wings, looked around, and flew away. The flies upon the wall began to crawl, the fire to burn brightly, and to cook the meat. The meat began again to fizzle. The cook gave his lad a box upon the ear, which made him call out, and the maid began to pluck the fowl furiously. The whole palace was once more in motion, as if nothing had occurred, for the 100 years' sleep had made no change in anyone. By and by, the wedding of the prince with Briar Rose was celebrated with great splendor, and to the end of their lives they lived happily and contented. So that was the story of Briar Rose. I thought it was really interesting because, again, I've never heard it before. I've only ever seen the Disney movie. So I hope that you guys enjoyed reading that with me, and I will see you later. Bye.